continue along some of those themes, especially the first point that Amba mentioned, which was Aadhaar, which is sort of broadly, well, that's specifically a specific example of something we're going to talk about, which is identity. I should introduce you to the panelists first. Immediately to my left is Zara Rahman, who has just got a promotion and has a new job title that I've scribbled over the old one, which is Director of Research and Engagement at the Engine Room. And she can tell you what the Engine Room is. And Malavika, further to the left of me, not politically, is Executive Director.
Yes, we can get into that.
Of Digital Asia Hub and Faculty Associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. That I think we can figure out what it does. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do you want to very quickly tell us what the Engine Room is?
Sure. We are an international non-profit organization. Our mission is to support civil society to use technology and data in a strategic and effective way.
And Malavika, do you want to tell us what Digital Asia Hub is?
It's a baby outpost of the Berkman Klein Center for all of Asia. Just a very small mandate.
Cool.
Just the whole region.
Cool. Yeah. Keeping it small.
Keeping it.
Right.
All right, so I'm going to do something I'm going to do at the start of every panel, because I'm not sure how many of you have read this sort of and memorized it. But so I'm just going to read out the subject of the panel, so you know the terms in which we're having this discussion. It's think of what I'm saying as being in italics or in inverted commas. So, as billions more people and tens of billions more devices come online, boundless amounts of data are created. How do we use it for good? Brackets, development, smarter cities, close brackets, and not bad. Brackets, surveillance, comma, insecurity, close brackets, question mark. Right, close inverted commas. So, data balance. Wait, the reason I do this
the lawyer
is because I think
wants to put a few commas back in. Okay.
Hey, the editor in me wants to do a lot of things with this, but here we are. The reason I do this is because I think it's important to define the terms of what we're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about how we should use data for good rather than evil, but this is a problematic notion to start with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very earnest topic, very sweet. But what is...
It is very sweet.
I mean, any state, even liberal democracies, they see it as good that they have lots of data on their citizens. I mean, these can be used both for development and for surveillance. Businesses see it as good that they can track what we're doing and know all of our needs and can serve us better, more efficient, productivity rises, etc., etc. Utilities see it as good that they get to stick smart meters in our homes, less wastage, better billing, so on and so forth. I mean, I don't necessarily see all of these things as good, or as the topic says, there's a balance. But so let's just start with who is this we in the how do we make this happen, and who decides what's good? Either one of you, please feel free to go.
I mean, I guess ideally the we would be every individual who would be well equipped to make informed decisions and have the skills to make those decisions in a way that matches their politics and their preference. I think what we're seeing today is that we don't have that access to that information, and we aren't able to question our devices and to question the companies in the way that we like. At the Engine Room, we've been referring to this kind of lack of skill as a lack of technical intuition. So basically the ability to understand whether the technical systems that we're using actually match our politics and our preferences, the ability to ask the right questions, to ask smart questions and understand the answers in a way that makes sense to us, and the capacity to do something about that, to change our decisions based on the information that we've learned. I think I appreciate the kind of the sentiment of your question that the binary of good or bad is actually really not helpful, because that's so subjective.
I guess the subject line is more helpful than the longer topic, right? The balancing bit, that's the key word here. You don't like balancing? What would you use, Marvin?
No, I think the road to data hell is paved with balancing metaphors. I really loathe this idea that, you have these binaries, we balance it, we get it wrong, it's okay, we tried. It's some kind of calibration, some kind of equilibrium. It doesn't matter if it's the right one, but we tried. And I don't know, I feel like we're often framing these things as being oppositional or at least orthogonal, when you can actually optimize for both things. You can have privacy and security. You can have transparency and privacy. And I think framing them either as hierarchical values along a chain or framing them as things that can never be reconciled, and that somehow there has to be some kind of really awkward balancing act. I really dislike that. So,
okay, so let's...
So basically, we've shredded the entire
premise of the panel.
We can throw
Cool.
this out of the
So
window.
now we can have a real conversation. Great.
Now we're done.
So, Malavika, you work on Aadhaar, is that correct?
I have done.
You have worked on
before
Aadhaar.
it
So
killed
that's...
me. Yeah.
Those of you who were already here for Amba's talk will be familiar with it, so we don't need to go through that entire thing again. But for those of you who've just walked in, Aadhaar is India's gigantic digital identity scheme. It name, address, date of birth, fingerprints, iris scans. I'm not eligible for one, unfortunately. So, Malavika, to what degree is Aadhaar, do you think, where does it fall on that? I don't think you even use spectrum. You said these things can be used for everything. But so Aadhaar obviously has good things about it. The fact is that until Aadhaar, there were hundreds of millions of Indians who had no way of proving who they were, no birth registration even. But as we've discussed, or rather as Amba discussed, also has, it can be used not just for widespread surveillance, but can also become a tool for private interests that don't necessarily square with what is in the interest of citizens. So how would you deal with something like that?
I mean, I've dealt with it by resisting it in every way I can. But I think one of the problems that Aadhaar and other sort of surveillance systems that start off with some kind of good intention, or at least that's how they're framed, as being developmentally utilitarian and good. I think the problem is that they are seen as solutions to a genuine problem. So it's not like they're sort of, birthed in the void for no reason at all. They are seen as an answer to a problem which is a very real, genuine one, which is the fact that for a lot of people, because they don't have good birth records, decent registrations, no other kind of identification documents, there is a problem, right? Whether this is the right one, whether it's proportional, whether it's launched in a vacuum of legal rights and obligations and checks and balances is, I think, the real question. So I think there are many ways you could calibrate a program like this for it to be more rights respecting. It could be genuinely voluntary, the way it was originally intended to be, and which they still, there's still this double speak around the fact that it is, which I think is really kind of cynical in some sense when you say it is voluntary, you don't have to have this ID. Oh, but wait, you want to go to school, you want a meal, you want education, you want a scholarship, you want a bank account. Oh, well, then you need one, right? So then when you sort of make every single thing dependent on this ID and use it as your gatekeeper, then it's really cynical to keep saying it's voluntary, right? It's voluntary if, I don't know, for those of you who live in sort of the Ice Age, if you remember the old sort of Google Village, was it? Where, of course, you can have privacy, but you live in this, windowless bunker in the middle of a cornfield in Utah or wherever. It was this sort of, animation around how this is how you can have absolute privacy and not be seen. You can also not function in the real world.
Exactly.
Right? So I think that's the problem we're dealing with.
The thing is, it's very easy, I suspect, I mean no offense, but it's easy for people in this room to think, these are problems for other people in other places, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, where the idea of national ID has always been fiercely resisted. There's this idea in this country and in America, but especially in this country, that, this is not Germany. Nobody can ask me to show my papers.
Even Germany says, don't ask me to show me my papers.
But the difference is that in Germany, you do have a national ID, you need to carry it around.
Yeah.
But I think this, like the other argument where you point out that it's framed as voluntary but isn't necessarily, in this country, you guys may not have, the Brits amongst you may not have national IDs. But the fact is, in this country, because of the sort of bringing in of borders away from airports and ports, I mean, still there obviously, to your home and your workplace, you are asked to show ID. So when I show up in this country and I want to rent a house or I want a job, I need to prove my right to work here and to live here, which is fine. I'm a migrant. I hold an Indian passport. But you need to do the same thing. You need to show your British passport or your whatever other form of British ID that you have. You're still being asked to show your papers. It's just, it's a roundabout way of doing the same thing. Anyway, sorry, that's a minor complaint of mine that I sort of try and remind people. Zara, you're also working with ID and with biometric registration, but in your case with you're looking at the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Now, that's a very different situation. You have Bangladesh has a large number of new residents who they need to register, hopefully provide services to. Does that qualitatively differ from the Indian debate?
Yeah, I think it really does. The Rohingya are I guess a little bit of background, one of the world's most persecuted ethnic minorities, if not the most. They've suffered a couple of genocides in the last couple of years and been driven from their homes. So up until, I think, 2016, there were an estimated 1 million Rohingya people living in Myanmar. Now 700,000 of those have fled to Bangladesh after the genocide. So that means in Bangladesh we have 700,000 refugees. And both the Bangladeshi government and the Myanmar government have said that they don't want to give refugee status or a home or land to the Rohingya refugees. So the context in which this registration is happening, the Bangladeshi government have explicitly said the reason that they're registering and collecting the data of the Rohingya is to make sure they do not stay in Bangladesh. So they've been very explicit about this. It's not even that it's being done in this is to help you access all these services. They've been very explicit about that. They're collecting, in some cases, in partnership with various refugee agencies who are doing it with good intentions.
So the idea is we need to know who you are so we can round you up and chuck you out at some point.
Well, I mean, they've not been that explicit.
Right.
But if we were to be cynical, which it's not even being that cynical, they've suffered a genocide and they've been told to get out of both countries. They're stateless. They're collecting their fingerprints and their names and family members and building this database. And in Bangladesh, for example, you need to give your fingerprints even to get a SIM card. And the Rohingya who are there are operating under a code of conduct by which they are not allowed to leave the land that they have been assigned. They're not allowed to get jobs. They're not allowed to get SIM cards. They're not allowed to get phones. They're not allowed to have contact with other people. And it's really not a far jump to imagine that this database could be used to control either their freedom of movement or their actions or what they do. And yeah, I mean, I think that the basic premise is that this is being done not even with the good intentions.
What's the alternative, though? I mean, to look at it from the point of view of any state, when you have 700,000 people show up, you do need to know who they are. Whatever you do with that information, that is a starting point, right? When I have some sympathy with the collection of this sort of information, whether for natural-born citizens or for migrants.
I think the alternative is to treat them as human beings.
Yes.
In a way that you would treat other people as human beings. So if you're not asking Bangladeshi citizens to do that, then why are you asking the Rohingya to do that? The country already has 160 million people. 700,000 isn't making much, honestly. I mean, if we think of the way that data is being collected on migrants in various countries, they're being treated as though they are subhuman people who can give up their rights to data, to privacy, in a way that citizens of countries like the UK are not. And I think that double standard is hugely hypocritical.
Right. As somebody who's had to give up my fingerprints on several occasions, can't disagree. You've also said, Zara, that in terms of the use of tech by development agencies, by humanitarian and aid workers, you've used the words slow and thoughtful and intentional in the way they adopt new technology.
I said they should be. I didn't say they are.
Right, yes, they should be. I want to know what that means, but also I want to know what happens when, and I think this relates to a degree to Aadhaar as well, what happens when we start off with the idea that we're building something for good, and then it just sort of slips into, if not evil, just incompetence?
I mean, I think starting with the premise that we're doing anything for good is a really dangerous route to go down. I think it opens us, it's a huge vulnerability in the non-profit space, because we say, oh, we're doing this for good, so we can justify anything, and we can say the ends justify the means, and yeah, we're violating a few privacy rights on the way, but look at the end, they get food and water, isn't this wonderful? And I think that's hugely hypocritical. The ends do not justify those means, and we need to be holding us, if we're saying that we're fighting for social justice, we're trying to protect human rights, we need to be doing that along the way, or else we're not being true to our mission. And with regards to my plea that humanitarian workers would be slow and thoughtful, I see sometimes that innovation is seen as this quick, fail fast, move fast and break things approach that has been way too quickly adopted from Silicon Valley. despite the fact that humanitarian workers are working in a very different space. I think we really need to get that out of our heads and think of innovation as being something that solves problems in a new way. We can't afford to make mistakes in the same way.
Yeah, because there's human beings involved.
Yeah, there's human beings who are already the most vulnerable human beings in the world, who don't have the luxury of saying, no, I don't want this service, or even they don't have access to so many things, and we need to be cognizant of that when we're thinking about what's being built and what's being offered.
Malavika?
I think we also need to think about the fact that whenever we think of development, we think it's some country far away, it's poor people, it's illiterate tribals, it's ethnic minorities. What about people in inner city Detroit? Why aren't they being developed kicking and screaming against their will? Right? They're using mesh networks. They're trying to do everything they can to survive in a city that's actually crumbling and dysfunctional. But we're always thinking of doing good somewhere else in a country far, far away in another galaxy, right? We never think of it actually as being a local issue. So I'm really nervous about schemes that are beta tested in poorer countries on people with less agency and choice, as if somehow they can be seen as objects of development and targets of empowerment, rather than participants who have an equal right and an equal say in how their lives will be shaped. Right? I really don't like this petri dish of Silicon Valley being exported somewhere else without the norms, institutions, culture, legal institutions, safeguards also being exported with it.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say that's exactly it, isn't it? I mean, the answer to your question, which kind of answered yourself, is it's because of the state of regulation and enforcement in the countries in which these things are possible to do. And so, I mean, I've been working on a piece this week about credit scoring, and America, where credit scoring really took off, first through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then the sort of mainstream consumer credit score that showed up in 1989. There's still between 25 and 50 million Americans who don't have proper credit scores. And then when you read about fintech companies that are using cell phone data to create behavioral scores for people, and you ask yourself, why aren't they doing this in the US? It's because lots of very strong data protection and privacy regulation in the States, and they can't.
I mean, the US has weak data protection, but it's still not.
In terms of present day data protection, yes, but in terms of credit, actually, it has. It's got a couple of landmark 1970s laws. That brings us very nicely, I think, to Facebook.
I was thinking Chinese credit.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go in that direction too. But cool,
we can
Facebook, Chinese social credit, same thing.
The Chinese social credit debate I find like very mixed up. I try and avoid it because, for one thing, I am no expert on it.
Yeah.
And for another, a lot of it seems in the same way that if you find that I'm complaining too much, please tell me to carry on and ask questions. In the same way that we're complaining about development generally being like some poor kid in Africa, I think very often when we talk about anything happening in China, there's a sort of framing of the big evil Communist Party that isn't always helpful and isn't even always truthful. For example, with social credit, where there's at the moment a number of... How am I going on about this? Let's come back to Facebook.
I live in Hong Kong, so it is very real for me.
All right, let's discuss this afterwards. In terms of starting with the proposition of good or bad, or Zara, you said not necessarily very helpful to start with good either.
No.
What really concerns me about Facebook's core ideology is that it takes sort of simultaneously two things. Simultaneously, it takes as a given that it is a good, that connecting people on its own is a good. And at the same time seems to me to also be kind of neutral about it, that we're connecting people and then they can do what they want with it. And both of these, I think, are very, very tenuous positions. Is something like connectivity, that word on its own, can it be neutral? Can it just be neutral?
I think any kind of technology is political. I think it's deeply naive, and I hope, maybe one day Facebook will stop, or Silicon Valley in general, people working in tech corporations will stop saying that they're neutral, objective, whatever. I think that kind of approach actually just emphasizes the existing power inequities that we have today. So again, the premise of your question was on good or bad, and as I said earlier, I don't think that's a very helpful place to start.
Okay, so we can't do good. We obviously don't want to do bad. We can't really do neutral.
We can try our best. We can assess each decision as it comes to us given the context, by designing with the people who are involved, taking a more user-centric approach.
Okay, so
I think any kind of universal or global approach to any of these deeply complicated political, social problems is problematic.
Well, we have leader discussions on Monday mornings at work where people pick what they think one of our leaders should be, and then everybody debates it, and then at the end, at the end of the week, there's a bunch of leaders in there, and very often it starts with, well, it's very complicated. And then somebody drones on for 45 minutes about Brazil or whatever. But it sounds to me like the answer to this question is just, it's complicated. You have to do it step by step.
Complicated is a Facebook status about relationships. Right? It's not meant to explain the whole world. Things are complicated, and that's why you don't come up with a magic bullet. You don't sort of assume that connecting communities is your sort of get out of jail free card. I also think there's a certain hypocrisy in a company like Facebook, and I'm saying because it's endemic across the field. When you're very willing to take credit for an Arab Spring, but then you say, oh, the US election being swayed, oh no, that couldn't possibly have happened on our platform, right? So you can't have it both ways. Either you're able to shift opinion or you're not, right? So I think there's a certain venal attitude behind that when you take credit for good things.
So just on debate and discussion being complicated and taking things step by step, it's possible to do, surprisingly, and to a degree, when the Indian government is pushing widespread adoption of a certain technology on you. There's civil society, as we were discussing earlier. And also you can vote out the Indian government, as the Indian electorate tends to do every 10 years or so. You can't do anything with Facebook except leave, which also, let's face it, you can't really. Not only is there no sort of user say, there's also no shareholder say because of the share class structure, the way the company is structured. What do you do in that sort of a situation? Because what you're dealing with there is a company that has huge amounts of influence and is basically setting public policy with almost no civil society participation except on their terms.
I think the problem isn't just the lack of civil society participation, it's a lack of accountability and regulation and oversight in any way, effectively. I mean, I'm no lawyer, but I'd look actually to regulation and to policy fixing that kind of problem. So I think it's too big. I mean, if there's one thing I could emphasize from all of this, it's that this is a collective problem. All of these things that we're discussing, technology connects us, therefore these are all collective network problems, and that means that we need collective solutions. There's never going to be one individual action that is going to change any of this. It's going to have to be a solution that has various parts, from the policy level to the civil society participation, to recognizing the different contexts in which Facebook is being implemented, to setting up country offices, to hiring people who speak the languages, who deeply understand the context where Facebook is being used and can react accordingly to various things that are happening. And I think this is really, I mean, why having a diverse group of people with diverse sets of skills is really valuable.
That's a lot of work.
I think it's also not sustainable that they keep escaping regulation of any kind, right? You can't, the amount of lobbying that goes into having regulatory capture is astonishing, right? If they spend that much money actually fixing their product, we might have a very different Facebook, right? But I think as long as they keep saying we're just the pipes, we can't be, we're not actually an editor. They are a media company and an advertising company. To keep saying they're just pipes is no longer tenable, right? You can't keep avoiding liability for everything that happens on your platform and keep saying, oh, well, we're infrastructure, but we don't want to be regulated as a utility. I think it's becoming, more and more clear that that position is just not sustainable.
I think you're right. By today, in October 2018, this has finally sort of started gaining more, this argument has finally started gaining more widespread acceptance in policy circles and even in just general sort of layperson circles. Just until a year ago was a much harder argument to make. But okay, having said all of this,
they didn't have all the kinds of breaches that they've had. It's now become more visible, and it's just become more and more embarrassing for them to keep saying we can't do this, right? We don't need to be regulated.
So look, we've spent about 20 odd minutes, I think, complaining about.
I mean, I think we've been pretty not just complaining. We were suggesting solutions. We were being constructive.
But, okay, and this sounds kind of deterministic, but I do think there's no, and please feel free to agree with me as vociferously as you like. I do think there's no getting around the fact that a world of sort of large-scale, pervasive biometric data identity is going to be our future, not just in India, but everywhere. And I think it's probably more helpful to acknowledge that, accept it, try and shape it, that it's done well, rather than fight it so that it's not done at all.
Can I ask you what done well looks like?
Sorry?
Can I ask you what done well looks like?
Why don't you tell me what done well looks like?
I don't think it can never be done well. So
yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think it's interesting that you phrase it as it's going to happen, so let's accept it. I think, for me, one of the biggest fights that we have in social justice or internet health or privacy or anything is that with our imagination. If we're just accepting the very easy, convenient options that are presented in front of us by people, by governments, by companies who hold huge amounts of power, then of course it's going to happen.
So I can think of two examples of it being done well-ish. One is the Austrian one, which has a national e-ID, or is converting its national ID to an e-ID. And if there's anybody here from Austria, please raise your hand and tell me if I'm making this up or sort of vaguely correct. So good. Where my understanding is that the way the Austrian system works is that when you're interacting with government, you use your e-ID, but you only need to provide as much information as is strictly necessary for whatever transaction or service you are presently engaged in. That's one example. Another one is the Canadian one that was set up in sort of by banks and government and a third party. I forget the details of it, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. And then there's a third sort of tangential one. This sort of discussion would be incomplete without somebody mentioning Estonia at some point. I might as well get it out of the way, where the law is that you can only request any form of data from any citizen once, this being the government. And once you have it, then it's your job to go find it the next time you need it, rather than hassling the citizen and collecting it over and over again. To which one can argue, but that means there's some vast database somewhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think going between, like we were talking about governments and then we were talking about Facebook and we were talking about refugee agencies, I think for me it makes more sense to think about this in a much broader picture rather than thinking of like very specific cases. So even in the Estonian case, which is, as you say, kind of held up as a golden child, they've had data breaches. I went to a presentation once where someone tried to hack into their system and found breaches right in front of us on the stage. And I think that just doesn't get as much press as the very golden child, look at this amazing system. I think the premise of what you said earlier, this pervasive biometric data collection going to happen is more the kind of the thing I want to push back against and say, maybe there are various problems that have led to people suggesting the solution of collecting biometric data. I would much rather that we return to those problems and think about solutions to those problems that do not involve collection of biometric data.
Right. So I don't know, I feel like the logical endpoint of that argument is sort of Donald Trump's advice that you should just like send handwritten letters to people if you don't want it to be intercepted.
I think that's a very extreme answer. I mean, Donald Trump is not the answer to any logical anything.
Yeah. Whatever the question, he's the wrong answer.
Yeah.
No, but it seems to me that what you're saying is
I'm saying, like, let's go back to the problem.
I mean, are you saying biometrics themselves or biometric databases themselves are problematic?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, why?
You go. I did this.
What? Throw me under the bus. I think they're inherently problematic, one, because the technology isn't perfect. It differentiates between people. The error rates are worse on darker skin, darker eyes. They're not perfect in any scenario.
Because they're immutable.
They're asking...
Because you can't get rid of them, you can't change them.
If
they stay with you their whole life.
If they're breached, do I change? This is not Minority Report. I'm not Tom Cruise. I'm not going to walk around with my eyeballs in a plastic bag, changing them. So I think biometrics are deeply, deeply problematic for all those reasons. They're what we're born with. Like, I can't go change my fingerprints. I can't go change my irises. So they're they're presented as a very strong security feature. They're actually really, really weak. Like what happens if they breached once? Like that's it, over.
All right, listen, we've got 5 minutes.
The only way that I can imagine that being done well is if the individual were the one that held your biometric data. So if there were some way of saying, actually, all you need to do is verify that I am the same person as the person who gave my fingerprints to this thing. And you just need to match them. The system that I'm interacting with does not need to hold or store any of that data. And I remain in control of all of I remain kind of literally in control and in possession of all of my biometric data, then perhaps. But that's a very different use case to the thing that you say of a massive biometric
brought that up
database.
because that brings me to my last question, which I actually want to rush through because we have 5 minutes and I'm sure there are questions as well. Thank you. Because so I've been looking into this quite a bit, and there's a phrase I've heard quite a lot, which is self-sovereign, I can barely pronounce this word, self-sovereignty, sovereignty, self-sovereign ID on the blockchain, obviously. Where else are you going to put it?
We said Donald Trump and blockchain.
Let's just get it all over with.
Okay. Can we just say AI and then we're done with it? No, I think
robots.
Actually, this point about self-sovereignty, I think all of the examples that you mentioned are things where systems which are about attribute, things like anonymous credentials, that's where it can work. And I think ambient data is where all the analogies collapse, right? As long as I am presenting biometrics to a system and I know that I have to present my fingerprint, or I stand before something and it scans my irises, I know the collection is happening.
Right.
I think everything breaks down when it's ambient collection, when it's facial recognition at 50 paces, and that 50 paces is getting shorter and shorter. I don't even know it's being collected. I don't know it's being matched. I don't know it's being triangulated. So I don't have the ability to consent, right? I don't have the ability to not walk into public space. So I think all of these things around, yes, we can keep it safe. Yes, we can have rules around it. It all sort of gets very, very blurred and problematic when you're dealing with ambient data collection at the city level, in an airport, in all kinds of areas where voice is being collected as you walk down the street, conversations are being recorded, your face is being, matched everywhere, your location is being mapped. So I think all of the rules that you talk about, they can work in smaller systems. And you mentioned Estonia. It's really easy to implement a secure system when you're dealing with a small country, a rich country, and a country that's relatively homogeneous. Right? The second you're dealing with disparities of income, of gender, ethnicity, class, sexuality, everything becomes that much more complicated. So I think there are ways that attribute-based systems can work, like you were saying, where you have control over the data and you decide what attributes you present. So like very, very basic example, if you go to a bar and you want to order a drink, they only need to know you're above the drinking age. They don't need to know your name, address, and all what
how much over
yeah, exactly, all kinds of other things. So you don't even need to present your driver's license. And my old friend Casper Bowden had a wonderful analogy where he said it's like a Rubik's Cube. Each of them is like an attribute. You don't have to show everything to every transaction. In a particular scenario, you're just sort of saying, oh, you want X amount of information for me to do this transaction? Hang on a minute. And you just sort of scramble it and show just the pieces of data that are necessary for that, right? Amazon may need your address to deliver a package, then you give them your address, but you don't need to tell them what gender you are because that's not relevant. So I think credentials is the future, not identity.
Or maybe it's multiple identities.
Yeah.
But you can be fluid with your identity. You can decide which attribute from your identity you present to different places and different spaces.
Those are both really good points. I'm going to open this up for questions. We have a minute, 17 seconds, but you can hang around and and sort of shorten your break. I'm perfectly happy to hang around. Somebody will come to you with a mic.
Thanks. I'd add to that the right to be forgotten. You've produced it and then left it. Yeah.
It's more of a comment than a question. I think you have to say that at the start. More of a
Thanks. That was really great. I was wondering about how we, as researchers, we're really interested in how we translate these arguments about digital rights to non-digital civil society. So, for example, organisations who been working on police accountability or on violence against women or on those kind of social justice issues, how do we talk to those organisations about these critical issues and make sure that they're part of these debates? These people who've been doing incredibly effective advocacy in the face of spy cops and all the rest of it for many years.
Yeah.
How do we broaden out these issues to bring the non-digital folks on board?
Yeah, I think that translation piece is an incredibly important one. And that's what we also at the Engine Room are working a lot with, working with social justice organisations who don't come from this tech, open webby type place, who wouldn't be at MozFest, for example. The strategies that I found are actually just speaking their language, literally, or just in the terms that they use, whether it's movement justice language or social justice, or putting it into context of the particular problem that they're facing, and trying to dial back the assumptions that we make when we talk about technology and the politicization, and understanding that the way that tech is set up right now, all these systems, people are actually almost discouraged to ask questions. Like if our laptops break, we can't, in my case, parts of my laptop are actually glued together. I couldn't be more discouraged to fix that myself. They make it so that I am not, and not being, I guess, again, the framing that we're using at the End Room is building their technical intuition. So part of that is recognizing that other people working in social justice have a deeply critical and political lens on things. And all we need to do is show them that they need to apply that to this technical space instead of putting coders up on a pedestal and saying the technologists have it fixed, because they really don't, and they really need people from diverse backgrounds.
Do you think that started to happen though? Just like by this point in
I hope it does.
I don't know. I mean, all of us in this room probably have sort of similar level of familiarity with this stuff. I have no idea what happens outside.
The other response I'd have to Becky is that we're actually learning from these other fields rather than it being about, unidirectional thing, because things like Nothing About Us Without Us came from the disability rights movement. Thinking of damage in this technical space as ecological and environmental, thinking of externalities and, digital harm and like footprints and, toxic waste, that came from the environmental movement. So I think actually that cross-pollination of metaphors, ideologies, and even tactical and strategic ways of actually achieving policy reform, deciding where along the policy life cycle do you intervene, what does a good campaign look like. We're actually learning from fields. The technical space, although it seems all-encompassing, is a very new one. We've learned from movements that have been working on, feminism, on all kinds of things, way, way, way longer than us. So we're actually very humble when we're taking lessons, and I think it really takes a village, and we all need to be in this together because it is very intersectional. And these are all socio-technical systems.
Anyone else with a question?
Stunned everyone into silence.
Yeah.
I know you've mentioned instead of thinking about solutions to, say, biometrics and whatnot, we need to push back against the very notion of developing them in the first place. I was wondering if you have any ideas of, or any examples of organizations or folks that are actually working on that aspect, instead of saying more diversity, more inclusion, let's fix them and make them better, but that are actually working on the other end, saying let's just not develop, it's not actually to them, and that are on the front lines of work.
Yeah, I don't know if this is quite front lines, but we've been working with Oxfam over the past couple of years, and they actually, I talk about Oxfam all the time in this sense, I really like their approach, and they instituted an organization-wide moratorium on using biometrics 2 years ago, and that was at a time when almost all other humanitarian agencies were running at biometrics as this magical solution to solve all of their problems. And instead, Oxfam said, no, we actually can't assess the risk right now. We don't know what the consequences might be, so we're just not going to use them. And some people criticized that and said, what a backwards way of approaching technology. For me, that was an incredibly innovative way of approaching this new technology. And we worked with them earlier this year to carry out some research and look at how using biometrics in other humanitarian situations had played out, and then worked with Oxfam to figure out how that research would fit into their strategy. And what we found was that there were very, 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 very specific use cases where collecting biometric could be helpful with many, many caveats afterwards, like you delete it all afterwards, you destroy it, you use it for this one specific purpose, that kind of thing. But in the general space, there is no need for that. And the risks are just, they far outweigh what the positives could be. So for me, that's a really good example of an organization.
So what you're saying also about slow and thoughtful.
Yeah, exactly. They were really taking that approach.
All right, if there's no more questions, for some reason, if there's no more questions, we'll go have coffee and a cigarette. I mean, not all of us. All right, good. Thank you, everyone. Come back in half an hour. There'll be more.